Buonasera a tutti, buonasera alle persone che ci stanno
Good
seguendo
afternoon,
da casa
everybody.
e
Good
buonasera
afternoon to the
ai
people listening
colleghi
from
con i
home,
quali abbiamo
and good
condiviso questa
afternoon
iniziativa.
to the
Siamo arrivati
colleagues we're
al
sharing
secondo
this initiative
pomeriggio
with.
delle nostre
We're now
lectures on
at
Philo,
our
che sarà
second
un secondo
afternoon
pomeriggio
of
caratterizzato
meeting,
in maniera da
and
corrispondere allo spirito che
this
ha
will
sempre animato i
be
nostri
in
incontri,
line with the
ovvero sia quello
spirit,
di
which
un
has also
approccio
always
da un
been a
lato
characteristic of our meetings.
tradizionale allo studio
On the
della
one
religione
hand, a
alessandrina,
traditional approach
dall'altro
to
il
an
tentativo di
author,
sperimentare
Philo
nuove vie
of
che
Alexandria,
portano da
and
filone,
also an attempt
come potete
to
vedere
experiment in
dal
new
programma di oggi.
paths
In
which
effetti il vero centro oggi non sarà
refer
direttamente
to
Filone,
Philo. Today we
ma
won't be
il
focusing
personaggio
on
protagonista
Philo
del
himself,
trattato
but
che
more
abbiamo messo
on
al centro
the main character in
del terzo
treatise,
appuntamento, scusatemi, di
which
questa
is the
serie, ovvero
focus
sia
of our
Giuseppe. Già
meeting,
ieri
namely
naturalmente se ne è
Joseph.
parlato, ma
Yesterday,
oggi
of
lo
course, we
approfondiremo
discussed
e
this, but we'll
faremo un giro a mio avviso
explore
estremamente
this further today, and
interessante
I think we'll
che
have a very
parte
interesting
dalla mistica ebraica per
approach,
passare alla
starting
mistica
from
islamica. Poi
Judaic
vedremo
mysticism
la
to
ricezione
Islamic
del
mysticism. Then
personaggio
we'll
di
see the
Giuseppe
reception
attraverso
of
naturalmente il filtro filoniano del
Joseph
Corano ed
through
infine
the filter
riprenderemo
of
invece
Philo
una
in the
questione in
Quran,
generale
and
emersa
then
sia
we'll
negli
approach
interventi dei
an
relatori
issue
che nelle
which
domande,
came
ovvero sia
out
il tema
in the presentations yesterday and
dell'interpretazione
the
dei sogni, ma
questions,
lo
namely
faremo oggi
the interpretation of
in maniera
dreams. But
particolare
today
con
we'll
lo
have
spunto
a
della psicoanalitica.
special
Quindi è
approach
un approccio estremamente
uh,
originale
based
all'argomento
on
e
psychoanalysis.
senza
So it's a very original
rubare
approach to
ulteriore
the
tempo
subject,
alle
and with
relazioni
um,
e alla
no further
discussione, vi dico
ado,
soltanto
taking
come
up
si
no
articolerà
further
questo
time from the
pomeriggio.
presentation, the discussion, I'll
Avremo
tell you
due
what's
relazioni
going to
al
be
termine di
happening. We'll have
ciascuna
two
delle quali
presentations at
lasceremo
the end of
spazio
each.
per delle domande.
We'll be
Dopo le
leaving
prime due relazioni
time
faremo una
for a
pausa,
discussion.
così
After
come
the
abbiamo
first two
fatto ieri,
presentations, we'll have a
di
break
all'incirca 10 minuti, un quarto
of
d'ora.
around
Poi le
10 to
seconde
15
due
minutes,
relazioni
as we
con
did
le
yesterday, and
medesime
then the
modalità dello
next two
spazio per le
presentations
domande
with the
dopo
same
ciascuna delle
approach,
relazioni.
time for
Per
discussion
quanto riguarda le
after
domande
the
stesse, possiamo
presentations
utilizzarle nel
themselves.
medesimo
With
sistema che
regard
abbiamo
to the
utilizzato ieri.
questions, we can
Si
proceed as we
prenota
did
in
yesterday.
chat, vi verrà
You
attivato
can
l'audio dai
ask
tecnici, potete
for
rivolgere la domanda. Credo
to
sia
be
l'ora
able
di
to
fare
speak on
domande
the chat,
sintetiche
and
e
then
che
you'll be
diano la
given the floor.
possibilità
And I would
magari
like
di più
to
di un
stress
intervento. Detto ciò,
how
vado
important it is
direttamente
to
ad
make your question
introdurre il
concise so that more than one person
grande
can speak.
il
With
primo
this, I'd
oratore
like
di quest'oggi,
to start
che è
with
Saverio
great pleasure
Campanini.
with our first
Lo
speaker.
presento molto
Today,
rapidamente,
Saverio
sicuramente
Campanini.
molti di
I'll
voi già lo
introduce
conoscono.
him
È
very
professore
quickly.
di
I'm sure
lingua
many of you
letteratura
know him,
ebraica presso
professor of
l'Università di
Hebrew
Bologna.
language
Nella sua
and
carriera ha ricoperto
literature at the
altri
University of
prestigiosi
Bologna.
incarichi prima
He's
di
held
questo.
other
È stato a
important
Parigi, nell'istituto che corrisponde al
appointments.
nostro
He was at
CNR,
the
prima
institute in
ancora a
Paris, which
Berlino, la Freie
institute which is
Universität, e con
similar
tutta
to
la
our National
ricerca che
Research
si
Council, and
incentra
then in
soprattutto
Berlin at
sulla
Freie
storia della
Universität,
mistica
and
ebraica,
he's
sulla sua
conducted
ricezione
research
in
into
ambito cristiano, in maniera
Hebrew
particolare nel
mysticism and the
periodo
reception
del
in the Christian
Rinascimento.
culture,
Ha
particularly in
curato
the
l'edizione
Renaissance
critica di
period.
diversi testi
He
cabalistici ebraici,
produced the
oltre che
critical edition of a number
dell'attribuzione
of
latina
Kabbalistic and
degli
mystical
stessi
texts, as well
testi.
as the
Ha
Latin
una produzione
translation of the same
scientifica
texts. His
sterminata che va dalle
scientific
monografie
output
alle
is endless,
traduzioni, ai
from
contributi all'interno di raccolte di saggi, recensioni, articoli.
essays on
Vorrei
single
ricordarne
issues to
soltanto alcune
contributions
per
to
dare l'idea della
journals, just to
vastità della sua
mention a few to give
produzione.
you an idea of
È
how broad
stato
his production
editore e
here.
traduttore di
He
diversi volumi di
edited and
Gershom Scholem,
translated
lo
a number of
conoscete bene,
volumes
una
of
delle
Gershom
autorità
Scholem's
assolute rispetto alla mistica
works, one of
ebraica,
the
e
greatest
vorrei
authorities on
ricordare
Hebrew
l'ultimo, che
mysticism,
probabilmente non lo
and
conoscete molti,
I'd
molto
also
più
like to remind
recente,
you of
Four
the
Short Kabbalistic
four
Treatise,
short Kabbalistic
con la
treatise
Fondazione Bondoni
with the
Pastorio
Bondoni
nel
Pastori
2019.
Foundation in
L'intervento
2019.
del professor
Which is,
Campanini di quest'oggi
Professor
riguarderà la
Campanini
figura di
today will
Giuseppe
be
nel libro
speaking of
Zohar, che come dirà
Joseph
è
in
il
the Zohar,
testo fondamentale della
which,
mistica
as he will
ebraica.
tell us, is the
Quindi
fundamental
vi lascio
text
la
of
parola, lo ringrazio di essere
Judaic
intervenuto
mysticism. So I'll
al
give him the floor,
nostro
and I thank him very
convegno.
much for being with us at this meeting.
Grazie,
Many thanks.
grazie per l'invito.
Thank you very
Spero di
much
rispettare
for
i
the
tempi.
invitation. I hope
Il mio
that I can
intervento si
keep
intitola
to
Giuseppe
time.
il Giusto nello
My
Zohar,
title is
una
Joseph the
politica della mistica,
Righteous in the Zohar,
punto di
a
domanda. Si potrebbe
politics of
pensare che
mysticism?
l'allusione contenuta
Question
nel
mark. One
titolo
might
della
think that
presente
the
relazione
allusion
risale
contained
agli
in the
ultimi
title
anni
of
a
this
Gershom
report
Scholem, perché così
goes
è
back to Gershom
intitolato il
Schon,
suo
because
articolo che generò una
this
vasta
is the title of one
polemica,
of his
noti
articles,
di
which
consenso
generated
severo
a lot of
ampiamente nell'anno
argument and
1934.
also
In
harsh
realtà il
words
titolo,
in
come spiega Scholem
1934.
scrivendo
In actual
Benjamin,
fact, the
non era suo.
title, as
Era
Sholem
stato imposto
explained,
dalla
writing to
durissima
Benjamin, was
recensione
not
del
his.
libro di
It
Isaac
was something imposed to the very harsh review of Isaac Breuer's book, the Neue Kusari, in which an attempt was made to update Hirsch's thought of the very dark periods which started with Hitler's ascent to power, where there was an attack against the Zionist option and its refusal of diaspora. And this title was placed by the editor of the Jüdische Rundschau to attract readers because this would be shouted out by news vendors in the streets. Jüdische Rundschau could still be sold before it was forbidden by the Nazi authorities. The sense of Sholем's article is not exactly opposite to the title, but reveals that the political use of mysticism, something which is very topical, then could be a double-edged sword, which Breuer could use to condemn Zionism and also Scholem to defend it. In those very difficult years, Thomas Mann, who was not at all liked by Scholem, was writing his four-book work on Joseph and his brothers. 2 volumes had appeared in Berlin in 1932 and 1934. The third was to be published in Vienna in 1936, and the final one, Joseph the Provider, in Stockholm in 1943. Perhaps we're far from the enveloping style of Mann, but we have to feel that his political reading in the light of the Roosevelt's New Deal was very attractive for the figure of Joseph. The prodigiously handsome child, the interpreter of dreams, the faithful servant of his word given, and the venerated image of Jacob, which allowed him to resist the temptation of the wife of Potiphar, leave place to the mature plenipotentiary ministry. Joseph, after a very improbable path, reached the full peak of his life. But what power does he have? Man makes him an able counselor who allows the Pharaoh to build an empire, overcoming aristocracy and keeping the caste of priests under control. We can't forget that Egypt, the place of Joseph's rapid ascent, is the bottom of the abyss, what Tosman calls the country of monkeys, the idolatrous kingdom, where, and because of the lack of liberty, or because of constriction, or caused by famine or blackmail of the same Joseph, one can be led to descend. So in politics here, one descends, and this is the double-edged sword which Sholem was speaking of, and which good Yehuda Halevi, minister could speak of. Being a minister in Egypt with all his wealth was not preferable to being in the dust of the ruined temple. To understand Joseph and his paradoxical career between the depths of jail, dream, and the peaks of state and honors, which he dreamt, and in what way his events can be interpreted in a political way. And to do this, I'd like to present some passages chosen from Zohar, which is a collection of fundamental texts of Hebrew mysticism, written in Spain towards the end of the 13th century. To this, I'd start from the end, the beginning of the second volume of the Zohar, which contains commentary on the books of Exodus, and where there's a note which shows us how the Zohar interprets Joseph, commenting on the verse of Exodus 1:8, where we read, "There rose in Egypt a new king who had not known Joseph." In the Zohar, we find 2 interpretations. According to the first, pronounced by Rabbi Hia, the new king could be considered new because he took unheard of decisions. Rabbi Hia here is thinking of a passage in the Talmud where one is asked whether that king was truly new. In the treatise Eruvin, it's pointed out that a rabbi saw that newness of the new king as being a new king, whereas others consider it wasn't a new king, but his decisions were new. Rabbi here reconciles these 2 readings, saying that the king was truly new because his decisions actions were unprecedented, and therefore he says that that king forgot actively the good Joseph has done for Egypt. So not someone who wasn't able to, hadn't been able to meet, to know Joseph, but someone who forgot Joseph, didn't want to think of him anymore. In agreement with Rashi, Rabbi here says that the new king pretended not to know and decided to forget the good received so he could take his measures against the Jews. In this story of ordinary ingratitude on the part of the power, we see nothing mystic, but rather a rabbinic homily which is constructed according to the principles of medieval exegesis and made to be welcome to a public who is used to this. Second interpretation, on the other hand, is less obvious. Rabbi Yose sees the king as being new in the sense that God created a new angel, playing with the words melech, which means king, and malak, which means messenger or angel, and referring to the verse of Psalm 104:4, which says he makes the winds his messengers, but which was read as referred to the creation of angels, stressing that the verb ose is in the present, which means that the creation of angels is an ongoing act, and every day, as the Talmud said, new angels are created, often to sing the praises of God and to disappear as soon as this function is completed. In this sense, the newness of the king of Egypt is radical because he comes directly from God. It comes directly from God. In the same way that the creation is radically new against the doctrine of the eternity of the world. At the same time, we see that if the angel who oversees Egypt, the guardian angel of the Pharaoh, is an expression of the creative will of God, this issue, which caused so much thought among the fathers of the church or the first Christian thinkers like Origen, namely the induratio cordis pharaonis, the question of the free will of the Pharaoh, is here addressed and solved, even though in a way which leaves open the question on the sense of liberation, whether God is at the origin of slavery. But I'll leave this to another time, another place. Rabbi Yose at this point explains what should be understood when he says, who hadn't known Joseph, the Pharaoh, or the angel which oversaw Egypt, was from a different place from Joseph, had a different mystical origin, because he came from the place of separation, atar the fruda in Aramaic, whereas Joseph, or his guardian angel protected, came from the place of union, atar Yuda, which is equivalent to the title of Zadik, the righteous, which is widespread in rabbinic literature. At the same time, with a symbolical change among the most established on the basis of Proverbs 25, according to which the upright is the foundation of the world. This refers us to the Sephirah Yesod, the foundation with which Joseph is always identified in Kabbalistic literature. The statement of Rabbi Yose is very difficult to understand, even though he stresses that the place of division where the angel of Pharaoh comes from is only the paradisiac Nile, or namely the Pison, the river Pison in book of Genesis, Genesis 2:10, we read a river flowed out of Eden to irrigate the water of the garden, and there it divided into four courses of water. The first called Pison, which is identified by a robust exegetic tradition, Sadia Gaon, Rashi, and Nachmanides, with the Nile. However, this remains esoteric. Why Joseph comes from the undivided river? The answer allows us to approach the key with which the entire figure of Joseph is understood in the Zohar, since Yesod, one of the Sephirot, one of the dimensions of reality identified in the Tree of Light, and the mystical figure of divinity with the phallus, therefore, of this human figure, one understands that the river irrigating the garden is seen by Rabbi Yose as a sexual image, where the garden is the Shekinah, namely the Sephirah Machut, the final of the branch of the river, as the river, still undivided, is the the united flow of the emanation of Tiferet, descending to Malkat. The angel and his protectee, the Pharaoh, are linked to the divided flow of the river, the separation, which and therefore know nothing of Joseph. That Joseph should be identified with a symbolic river is something which is indicated in another passage of Zohar. We see the symbolic significance of another river, the one which the Pharaoh sees in his dream. Not the Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, but the Pharaoh who knew Joseph well. This Pharaoh dreamt a river and was able to appreciate the capabilities of Joseph to explain dreams. In the famous scene where Joseph interprets the two dreams of Pharaoh, the cows and the ears of corn, revealing that it's a single dream, there's one element which is not interpreted because there's no need. The cows are years and the ears, but Joseph doesn't interpret the Nile, which the Pharaoh speaks of. The Pharaoh says on the banks of the Nile. If everything in the dream is a 60th part of the prophecy, this also means that nothing is as it seems. The cows or the ears are not cows or ears. Therefore, Rabbi Elazar seems to be saying in this passage, the Nile is not the Nile, but is Joseph. He is the river which the Pharaoh saw in his dream as identified with the Nile, because there couldn't be anything else for the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh didn't know Joseph yet. But Joseph considered it best not to reveal this detail. Joseph is the river which the Pharaoh has seen. Rabbi Chia, already one page before, the page we're speaking of, had opened his homily on Genesis 41:1, which is the beginning of the Parashah Miketz, which marks the ends of Joseph's troubles and the beginning of his political ascent, with a quote from Proverbs. With justice, a king sustains the country. And one of the possible meanings is that Joseph, the righteous, even though here the word is mishpat and not zedek, sustained the country, as the verse said. The whole country, the whole of the earth came to Egypt to stock supplies. This is in Genesis. But Rabbi Shimon had commented that the dream of the Pharaoh had as its essential content Joseph. What the Pharaoh sees is Joseph because he dreamt the river, which he had interpreted as the Nile mistakenly, whereas it wasn't the Nile, but Joseph, the river he saw. And Rabbi Simon says that every time a river is dreamt, it is Joseph who is dreamt, because every river is the image of Joseph the righteous. Why? Here there's a mystery. He who dreams a river, says Rabbi Shimon, dreams of peace. As it is written, I am going to send peace flowing over her like a river. This is Prophet Isaiah 66. The same verse can also be read in the treatise on dreams of the Talmud, because dreaming a river is not necessarily a good omen. It's necessary to get up early and to recite that verse of Isaiah on the river of peace or prosperity before the dreamer thinks of another verse of Isaiah, suffering will come like the flood of a river. So instead of a bad omen, it's better immediately to declare a verse as being good omen. The interpreter of the dream and the meaning of the dream are the same according to the Zohar. And again, we can't understand the reference to Joseph unless it is in Kabbalistic terms. If Joseph, as we said, is the Sefirat Yesod, he is the river of emanation, and it's thanks to him that abundance will fill the land of Egypt, with their allowing him to nourish the land with a delicate allusion to the sexual image, which is always around the figure of Joseph, because Yosef, in his relationship with the Malta, which is also the land of the living, the land of Israel, as a collector of the flow in divided of the emanation. At the same time, Zohar seems seems to allude, indicating in Joseph the River, the author or the maker of peace, in one page of the Talmud, where the phallus is called the peacemaker of the house. So this is explained through which justice the king makes the land beneficent and sustains the king, whereas, as the second hemistake of Proverbs said, who harasses the land takes it to ruin. And this is the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, an evil-hearted king who causes the ruin of his country with excessive tax and increasing the weight on the work on the Jews. If we bear in mind the principle of identification between Joseph the righteous and Yesod, the pages which, particularly in the first volume of Zohar, deal with Joseph become less obscure. Joseph is the righteous one who is not seduced by the wife of Potiphar, who cannot resist his beauty and wants to deviate the course of the emanation far from Malkut in order to absorb divine energy. In the Zohar, that woman is diabolical, who spends her time not speaking words of love to try to seduce him, but on the model of the devil who accuses sinners before God. The woman every day speaks to Joseph to discredit, in his eyes, humanity and convince him to sleep with her, namely in hell. But Joseph doesn't listen to her. He studies law day and night, and in this way he cannot hear the insinuating words of the woman who bears a negative and pessimistic anthropology. Joseph in this follows the example of the Holy One. May he be blessed, where despite the accusations of the devil against humanity, despite them being founded, has compassion of the world and lets even the evil live. And so Joseph doesn't listen to the woman feeling compassion for the world. In this act of stoic resistance, where he protects the sign of the covenant, he deserved the title of righteous, transforming himself in a source of living water, which only Malkut, the kingdom, could transform from deep well to source, spreading the emanation. Thanks to this harsh apprenticeship, he is not alone, even though solitude is the dominant feature of his descent into the system in Egypt in prison, and the ascent of Joseph in the house of Potiphar in the court of the Pharaoh, because the Lord is with him. Joseph is given the insignia of power, but the Zohar comments the Pharaoh only gave him what was his by right, and which he'd always had, but which he deserved, resisting to temptation.
To explain why the years of abundance precede the years of famine, you have to see only when the conditions were adjusted to the survival. This is when man was created. So the years of abundance were instrumental to the enrichment of Israel. So the riches, no less than the tribulations, are aimed at making Israel worthy of the world to come, which coincides with the Sephira Binah, that is intelligence, the origin of all judgment and all justice, with redemption in view. Thus, Joseph the Righteous is the model of all kingship, because in every way he resembles the tree of the Sephirot, that is the Holy One. Blessed be he, because he harvests the grain, foreseeing famine, because he administers justice to guide the people to redemption. Joseph, moreover, is not a king, but he is the king's counselor. Nevertheless, by virtue of his constant union as Yesod with Malkut, he can be defined as king, the very idea of kingship, and therefore a model for every earthly king who wishes to give well-being and justice. We would say good government to his people. However, Israel does not lack a king, and he is prefigured in Joseph's brother, Judah, David's ancestor. So Zohar has certainly not overlooked this aspect, and commenting on the first verse of the parasha, the text notes that both were kings. And this is the basis for Rabbi Yehuda homily, which opens by quoting a verse from Psalms. The kings have gathered, they are advancing together. But while Rabbi Yehuda sees it as a summit meeting to discuss Benjamin, because Judah, who is responsible for the sale of Joseph, whom he did not recognize in the Pharaoh's minister, does not want to take responsibility for the loss of Benjamin, for which he vouched in front of Jacob, Rabbi Elazar instead does not want to take responsibility for the loss of Joseph. And the two kings had to converge because Joseph is the righteous and Judah is Mahud. And out of their own meeting, many benefits would flow for the whole world. Peace for all the tribes and the rebirth of life in Jacob, who is the one who he thought he would never see. Rabbi Yehuda had already resolved the apparent contradiction, affirming that the meeting between Judah and Joseph contained a mystery of faith. Razad Mehem Manuta, the divine will is manifested as the union of two crowns, or rather the coronation of a couple, two worlds that bind in one and in one meet. This meeting opens up treasures, accumulated, distributed, two holy worlds, the world above and the world below. The emanative model of Zohar understands Joseph as a reflection, as one dimension of the divinity, and his beneficent influence reflects the emanative flow of the lower sphere, making Joseph a king, an archetype of kingship, by virtue of which the good king will reign in peace and justice, and the evil king will seek to divert the influence from the realm of good governance to the realm of chaos, darkness, and evil. And the more the earthly king corresponding to Malkut will wade through the three of the Sephirot and directs his desire toward the Yesod, to Joseph model or fruitful continents, the more his kingdom will prosper. The reverses of fortune, the ups and downs, the crisis, as we may say, will by no means be avoided, but will contain with themselves from the beginning the remedy and their ultimate meaning. It is perhaps not by chance that the future Messiah king is divided in the Jewish tradition in two, the Messiah son of Joseph and the Messiah son of David, that belongs to the tribe of Judah, according to a model of encounter between the kings that we have begun to understand as a mystery of faith, a fertile encounter that unifies the emanative flow and makes a well, a spring of living water. These doctrines did not remain the exclusive heritage of Jewish Kabbalistic speculation, but found their way, after the first sensational revelation by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, into the Platonic culture of the Christian Renaissance. To give just one example, in the Scripturam Sacram Problemata of Francesco Zorzi, or the Franciscan Observance, printed in Venice, we read a brief meditation on the verse Accedens propius Judas. Zorzi here writes, "It is not possible that this verse, placed in such an important position, that is at the beginning of the parasha, does not have a mysterious meaning. It is symbolic of the connection that there must be between the king, Judah, and the righteous Joseph. For, as Augustine writes, what is a kingdom without righteousness but abuse and robbery? But on a closer inspection, Joseph and Judas was, and here Zorzi explicitly evokes the Zohar, his guide in this meditation on the scripture, is a meeting of two kings, due reges convenerunt, one of the active life and the other of the contemplative life, so that the kingdom would be perfect. This kingdom that the two brother patriarchs saw and would be perfect is the kingdom that was fulfilled by Christ in both dimensions of life. The Christological dimension that Zorzi makes the Zohar text take, of course, possible by making a careful selection of the Zohar text, keeping silent what is not fit and underlining what confirms it. But here what seems interesting to me is that the Zohar, with its esoteric interpretation of the biblical story, could influence a Franciscan theologian, convinced that it contains secrets and prophecies of great importance for the essential doctrines of Christianity. Christianity, such as the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Messianic nature of Jesus. I cannot dwell here, as I have done elsewhere, on the political implications that Zorzi drew from the Zohar around his idea of a consecrated king who would lead the whole world to peace, identified by another assiduous reader of the Zohar, who indeed translated it into Latin, the general of the Augustinians and Cardinal Egidio da Viterbo, Charles V, while Zorzi seems more inclined to identify the possible righteous sovereign with the Doge Andrea Gritti, or for a short period with Henry VIII. But again, it is not the identification with a pure transient that aroused our greatest interest, but rather the fact that one could see in the Zohar an authoritative text that was worth the effort necessary to penetrate first the linguistic hull of the solemn Aramaic in which it was written, then the shell of the symbols that weave its content, up to the disconcerting theosophical kernel that it contains. Until the last days of his life, Zorzi continued to meditate on the words of the Zohar and composed, by then a very old poem in Italian, which appeared in print only about 30 years ago in a form which is of a long prosopopoeia. Zorzi imagines that the biblical patriarchs appear to him as in a vision from Dante and engage in amiable conversation. Now in Canto 50, Zorzi asks Joseph a series of questions, namely whether Joseph has observed sexual continence during the famine years. Here, the monk wants to know from Joseph whether he remains chaste during famine, and even why. Because the parts that were beaten by hunger may generate lusts that was then removed. Now the allusion to the wise men, and in the poetic fiction, Zorzi, having the opportunity to meet Joseph, asks him to confirm what he read in the Zohar about Joseph, which would have sealed his source in the years of famine, the cause and the consequence at the same time of the raging scourge. Now, since the biblical text is confined to saying that Joseph had his sons in the time of abundance, it is lacking confirmation that he was chaste during the 7 years of the lean cows. Joseph, in his answer in the Canto 43rd, not only confirms the supposition, so he is also fully confirming the explanation proposed by Rabbi Shimon in the Zohar. In the time when the angel in charge of harming the man prevails, the children who were generated in that time would be infected by the so-called evil demon. Therefore, Joseph says, and here he's quoting the ancient Italian, and in the prose paragraph that Zorzi composed to explain the most obscure allusion of the poem, since he adopts the first person of the character who speaks in verse, it is Joseph himself who explains that he abstained from generation as long as the scourge lasted, and adds that he did read the Zohar. And I know that some sages also have written. So the Patriarch Joseph read the Zohar, to which Zorzi alludes, to confirm that the Zacharic exegesis had seen right. What better validation for an exegete if the biblical character reads the biblical commentary as an actor or author who might read a review comes to seal the conjecture of the interpreter. The dream of a visionary and the dreams of a metaphysics of power could not be only explained by the first oniromancer, just Joseph the Just or righteous. Many thanks to Professor Campanini for this very rich presentation that went from the biblical narration to the Hebraic mysticism, and as you've heard in the second part, it switched to the Christian. This was of extreme interest, and now we would happily accept the questions, as I did explain you. You may raise your hand, and the mic will be activated, allowing you to ask your question. There is one question. No? Well, then will ask one question to Professor Campanini. There was a passage in his presentation which I think was of great interest, which has got to do with the theme of study. And at a certain point, you were saying that by studying the law day and night, Joseph somehow is capable of defending himself. And here, to switch to a Christian jargon, this is what we would call maybe temptation. So with this respect, I would like to ask you to please elaborate on this, since within the rabbinic tradition, there are many figures. David so much can talk about the arrival of the angel of death, because he was so deeply committed in studying by day and night. Now, I would like to have a comment from you. Yes. What seems to be very interesting in this mention that was made of a practice which was widespread, the one of constant study to escape temptation, which was very much pressing, especially on the side of the wife of Potiphar. Well, the rabbinic reading of this praxis is not afraid of doing an anachronism, because Joseph is studying it and knows it even before it's being published. And this is a theme which is not only going across the Kabbalistic literature, but also across the Midrashic literature in a very important way. If we think of Abraham, who sticks to the halakhic rules that came later on, and the element that strikes us is that the law somehow exists together with Joseph and saves him from material temptation coming from the wife of his master. And this is existing even before the revelation of the Torah, before the Torah is written by the finger of God, according to the Exodus book. So the Torah already exists and is with the Joseph. So with the Torah, we have to identify the presence of the book. So studying the Torah means that you are merging with the Shekhinah, meaning being together. And this is something that's said many times over in very concrete and human situations, even not just dealing with patriarchs, but also dealing with the then rabbis. It is said that if a man is traveling, how can he respect the onah, that is the hourly duties that are devoted to the so-called marital duties, that is the pleasure, the physical pleasure, the body pleasure. So how can you do that? And in the Talmud, there is a discipline when people travel. But here we hear that the Shekhinah is fulfilling the need. It is embracing the rabbi while he is traveling. He pacifies and fulfills him and satisfies him. So this is the image. So here we are not thinking that we have to study because we won't be distracted by a sinning woman or a sinful woman like the wife of Potiphar, but rather the one of not lying with the wrong woman, which is already something that could exclude us from sinning, because finding the right woman, we are not going to be available to the sinning woman. So I believe this is what we can read in between the lines of that Zohar passage. Many thanks for this very interesting answer. Let me once again ask if there are any other questions. I think Rav Levi has his hand raised. So maybe, Rav, would you like to ask a question? Remember that you have to unmute your mic. I honestly didn't want to ask any Kabbalistic question, because tomorrow I will have to talk about the Kabbalah in a given sense. But since Zorzi was recalled, I would like to throw in another theme, that is Joseph and the doctors. That is how the figure of So, by his being a very authoritative figure, how he flows into the debates and in the internal debates and competitions that existed inside the Medici family. And the many other ideas that are carefully kept. So just a comment from you, maybe. I am not sure whether this was a question or not, but anyway, let me say that I did recently happen to read something written by a converted Jew, Paolo Sebastiano Medici, in one of the very early works, the Midolla of the Mua Santa, dedicated to Cosimo III. So again, here this is translated from the Tuscan, ancient Tuscan. And here it is said in the dedication that the function of Cosimo III from the family de' Medici is the one of attracting the celestial or heavenly flows so that the Tuscany might benefit from this very special piety. So the righteous and just sovereign is bringing about well-being because he's attracting the heavenly flows. So here we see the function of Paolo Sebastiano Medici, well-known convert, born Jew and brought up in Judaism, a function that has been transported so as to praise the de' Medici family, and that the de' Medici at the end of the 1600s were using this kind of imaginary, that is the sovereign that allows celestial flows flow down from heaven to bring out prosperity, something that may be, depending on the piety of the sovereign, is something which is inspired to the figure of Patriarch Joseph. This is just a very, very random example that I did happen to read a few minutes before the meeting opened. Maybe this is something we could dig into without thinking of the iconography or the image of Joseph in the painting works. But even only in a strictly Kabbalistic meaning or sense, we could look at this image, and we know how much the Medici family, starting from Lorenzo onwards, was very deeply interested in the Kabbalah, and also especially interested in Joseph. Many thanks, Professor Campanini. Your contribution was highly stimulating.